Welcome to Season 2 of the Cineposium podcast. I'm Martin Ibarra-Ramos.
And I'm Alex Apicella.
And we're thrilled to be back to present and discuss some more great films for you all with a fresh, slightly longer, and more conversational format that we think you all will quite enjoy. In the case that any of you are first-time listeners, Cineposium is a graduate student organization at UCLA focused on film and media programming. Our first season, which is available online now, offers a sort of eclectic selection of programming with academic presentations on the film or films of each episode. As I mentioned before, our second season will be a bit different. I'll let Alex discuss how the show will look moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So every single week, we're going to be inviting members or collaborators of Cineposium to curate a film for remote viewing, just as we had done before. What's going to be new is that we're going to actually be having more of a conversation about the film within the podcast episodes. New episodes will be published every Thursday, just as usual, with various members from Cineposium coming on to discuss the films with our weekly curators. So you're going to be getting a little bit more engagement and less of a presentation now. This week's curator is going to be our chair of Cineposium, Reed Williams. This is his many-if time coming onto the podcast. I'm very excited to have him back, so welcome back to the show, Reed.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
All right, so this year marks the 10th anniversary of production company Spectre Vision. Started by writer-directors Daniel Noah and Josh C. Waller and actor Elijah Wood, Spectre Vision has produced bold, unconventional genre films such as A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, The Greasy Strangler, and Color Out of Space. So to celebrate, we're going to discuss a well-loved, critically acclaimed Spectre Vision film from 2018, Panos Cosmatos' Mandy. The producing trio describes their films as museum-grade pop art and explorations of the uncanny. Mandy definitely checks those boxes. It features plenty of pop culture homages and employs a striking kaleidoscopic color palette, but it also dives headfirst into topics such as grief, revenge, masculinity, psychedelics, you name it. The plot is pretty simple. Red, played by Nicolas Cage, and Mandy, played by Andrea Riseborough, live a contented existence in Crystal Lake circa 1983. One day, a cult leader, played maniacally by Linus Roche, sees Mandy and sends a demonic biker gang to kidnap her and detain Red. After setting himself free, Red seeks vengeance by setting off on a primal, surreal rampage. So there's a lot to discuss in this film. Why don't we go ahead and just take turns talking about our initial reactions?
Absolutely, yeah. So we each, watched the film leading up to the recording of this episode, and I guess I'll go first. So, and I should admit, the first time that I saw this when it came out, I think my experience might have suffered a bit from, the fact that I think the film, when it came out, there was definitely a lot of attention with it, and for me, it might have been a little overhyped, particularly in how, in the later part of the film, it definitely takes this sort of 180 and it's described by many as this sort of psychedelic, trip of a film. And as we now know that we've all seen the film, that definitely is indeed towards the end of the film. And so I felt in my first experience with it that I was kind of waiting for it to get there. Having seen it again now, I find that it's such a valuable experience, and I think this is evidence of watching a film again, what can be gained from it, because I really paid attention to so much more going on, in the first half of the film, and I really, I guess I got a bit more from what the filmmakers were doing. I sort of saw a lot more of the layers involved and how it's really pushing boundaries in horror cinema that I'm really fascinated by. So, I'd say I really appreciated the film more this second go around for me.
Yeah, this is one of the many times that I have had the opportunity to watch Mandy. It's one of those films that I love to just come back to over and over again, just as like a film that is not only interesting to watch every single time you rewatch it, but also just because like it's one of those films that like, even though like the visuals are so key to it, it holds up even if like you're not watching it. I don't know if that's like a statement that quite makes any sense, but like when you're thinking of stuff that you put on for background noise, like it has to sound good. And then Mandy does like this great balancing between like sounding good, having like all this like great fantastic visual acting and visual aesthetics, but you know it holds up in like every single element, because it tends to be that like the higher the visual aesthetic of a film, the lower the actual like it suffers in other departments. It suffers sometimes in audio. And so this is one of those films that like I love to just watch very intently, but also can watch without all the like attentiveness that I would put into a standard watch of a film. And I would love to be able to work with this film going forward in my research, but I feel like it's one of those films that I would just never be able to actually work with, because there's so much here to grasp. It's like this falls within my purview. This falls definitely within like that gore porn genre, but it's so high art that like I feel like I could never even begin to address like all of the elements and complexity that goes into the so-called porn, the visual elements of this film. I could only ever address the gore, and the gore in this movie is phenomenal. Fantastically executed, practical effects, blood everywhere. Phenomenal.
Truly shocking. Yeah, I kind of forgot, honestly, because I haven't seen the film since it came out, and I forgot about some of these just vicious scenes and kills. But also just a credit to the filmmakers here, because you truly experience those moments, and I mean, yeah, I just, my jaw sort of dropped, and I remembered, oh yeah, it goes here.
Yeah, speaking of like the gore and just the visuals, I know that is those are a few of maybe the criticisms that I've kind of heard toward the film, is that maybe it's one of an example of like style over substance, right? And that was actually something I was a little wary of going in to rewatch this, because the other times I'd seen it had been in like kind of more rowdy midnight movie settings where everybody's there enjoying the experience of it together. So I was really curious to see how it would translate into just like a home kind of movie experience. And yeah, I think even if you don't have as large a screen or like really high quality speakers, there's still a lot to enjoy aesthetically. And I did start trying to, or I started to pay attention more to just sort of the themes the film was kind of going for too, and actually exploring the characters. And there was a lot about, speaking of your work, Alex, like there's a lot about masculinity in this film. Obviously from the villain, where, who, like, I definitely think Linus Roach like goes toe to toe with Nick Cage here as far as like a really unhinged performance. There's that great scene with him and Mandy where Mandy basically like breaks down his like fragile male ego by laughing at his terrible Carpenter's inspired folk song. Yeah, I'm curious to hear if that was something that stood out for you guys, just like the commentary on masculinity, because I think you see that in Red too, just in him seeking vengeance, and that, like, I think Cosmatos refers to him as like a barbarian in some interviews and stuff. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, if that crossed your mind at all.
Yeah, so it absolutely did. I'm unable to separate my gender studies background from any horror film that I watch ever in my life. I think probably one of my favorite scenes that kind of demonstrates the kind of commentary on masculinity that the film is working towards is a scene where, I apologize, I'm trying to find the in-universe term that they use for the drug. Does anyone know that offhand? It's like a specific name.
No, I thought it was something to do with LSD, but yeah, I'm not sure if there's something
Yeah.
specific.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think Bill Duke's character, yeah, says something about LSD, but I can't remember the exact name on the high power quality that
Yeah.
drives them.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, it like it anyway, there's a scene where one of the bikers is sitting at a table, and he's snorting the LSD lines, and on the television in front of him is a graphic porno that's playing on the screen. And then Red comes in, and they have like this fight. And the entire time in the background, the way that the scene is framed and the way the camera is positioned as Red and the biker are struggling and like wrestling with each other on the floor, you can see the porno continue to play on the background. And I love that scene. I love the contrast of what they're doing here is they're equating sex with violence directly in this very visual sense. And like, yeah, it creates like this fantastic commentary on masculinity, because you have two men fighting on the floor, and then on the screen behind them you have a man and a woman having sex. And I wow, it's so incredibly complex. Like that's the kind of thing that like Freud would watch the scene and write 3,000 words of poetry on it. Like, it's just like one of those films that just has like this really strong presence in terms of masculinity and gender and sex, and it's fantastic.
Totally agree. And I have to say, I mean, I'm not as versed in gender studies and in this area in particular, but I will say that a scene that stood out to me is, towards the end, when Red and Jeremiah, I think his name is, when they have their sort of confrontation, and it's Red sort of towering over Jeremiah, sort of representing this dominance that he now has. But there's this shift from Jeremiah from like sort of anger and rage to like desperation, and I'll try and find a way to say it not so explicitly, but he offers like oral sex, to say, is that what you want? And I think it speaks to that contrast between the various things going on here, which it feels under the surface but also kind of in your face in an interesting way, which I think this film does a lot of. And yeah, so much to appreciate in that way, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like it plays into the humor of the film a little bit too, because, speaking of like Freud, like, there's the part where Red is coming at one of Jeremiah's henchmen with the chainsaw, and then he pulls out like the bigger chainsaw, like, which is also just like sort of a humorous visual gag, I feel like. And that's something, when I was doing some research after rewatching the film, I feel like a lot of reviews or interviews didn't really bring up how humorous the film is. Like there's some really great moments. Even speaking to one of, I think, what's become a crowd favorite, which is Cheddar Goblin, which is like this really incredible moment after a really tragic part of the film where, I guess, spoiler alert, Mandy is killed, and Nick Cage comes in and is processing this, and this like ridiculously darkly surreal commercial for macaroni and cheese featuring this like goblin comes on, which was actually made by Casper Kelly, who did Too Many Cooks, to plug another episode of Cineposium I was on, directed that. So I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on Cheddar Goblin.
I totally thought of your episode on Casper Kelly's other work when that came on, because I was looking at the IMDb page for Mandy in preparation here, and I noticed his name attached to Cheddar Goblin, and I'm like, oh wow, like that makes so much sense. It looks so much like his work, and that mixture of like sort of macabre humor, I it's hard to sort of figure out how I feel about it. It disturbed me, but also I couldn't help but laugh. And especially the children in there, I don't know, it's such a fun experience. Yeah, but again, speaks to the sort of layers of contrast of this film that I think are really interesting.
Yeah, and this might get off the humor point slightly, but still stays on that theme of Mandy has a lot of intertextual references to other like horror material within
Absolutely,
it. Like,
yeah.
I mean, the Crystal Lake house and Friday the 13th reference. There's the chainsaw battle you see in like Motel Hell and Phantasm 2 and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Like there's the head crushing scene from Blade Runner. Like it's Mandy, it's so like aware. It understands like where it sits in terms of like its own canon of horror films and slasher films, and it consistently tries to like position itself like very much like aligned with that, which is interesting. I mean, like they even have like a Ghost Rider reference, and they have, you know, Nick Cage come out with like the huge chain that you would see from like the Ghost Rider movie that he was in. So like it has
Oh
like
wow, I
this.
hadn't thought of that. Wow.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. Like they know that like Nick Cage kind of came from like this Ghost Rider background, and they're like,
Yes.
well, if we're gonna have him on a motorcycle, yeah, no, it's great. It's fantastic.
I gotta say that that sort of cosmopolitan feel to this film of various horror subgenres is really interesting to me. One thing that stood out to me is since I've seen this film, I've put in some of my own research into folk horror cinema, and I mean this is certainly coded in that subgenre as well. I mean if you think about um, the cult here, the sort of luring in of the innocent victims. This film starts in a sort of rural setting. I mean, I guess the whole film is, but you get a lot of the visuals of landscape and how sort of remote their home is, sort of surrounded by wilderness. And I mean, it's just interesting how I would say the visual effects and editing style and everything sort of push all of these things further into this. I don't even know what to call this as a genre, like psychedelic um revenge slash folk horror slash I don't know, everything. It's so hard to like try and label this, but I guess that's not really the point. But I would also add Suspiria. This film feels so much like Suspiria to me in terms of the color palettes we see and the what feel like I don't know if you're aware of how much of it is practical effects, Alex, but the a lot of the visual effects here appear to be practical effects similar to what we get in Suspiria. So it reminded me a lot of Dario Argento's film as well.
Yeah, I don't know the like approximate like percentage of practical effects to visual effects, but yeah, no, every kill, every even like the hyper stylized ones to me look as though they were carried out practically.
Yeah.
Um, would phenomenal like work. That's stunning. That's
Yeah,
it
it's
just looks
truly
so good.
stunning and shocking all in one. Yeah.
Thinking of mentioning, the influence of like folk horror and Argento and all the other horror slasher films from the 80s. Um, that's and just thinking of how to categorize this film. That's something Cosmatos brought up in interviews, that this version of 1983 America is very fantastical and almost feels otherworldly, I guess.
Yeah.
And that kind of brought to an interesting question, is like, is even though this film draws on all these references and features homages to them, would you say this is a nostalgic film? I feel like especially in the 2010s we had so many films and television shows nostalgic for the 80s. Stranger Things, um, uh, Summer of 84, wasn't that I feel
Right.
like that was, yeah. So, and I think people talk about how some of those can maybe veer into the realm of like pastiche, but I'm not sure that doesn't feel like the case for Mandy. It feels like it draws on these references, but you don't get that same sense of nostalgia, or at least I don't. Maybe because I didn't actually wasn't alive during that time, but I don't know. It feels different to me somehow. It's hard to explain, which maybe goes into that thing of the uncanny that Spectre Vision tries to go for in their films. So yeah, I'm curious to discuss more about how Cosmatos employs these references and whether they're based in nostalgia and um, the role that plays in Mandy and his work.
Yeah, I would almost go towards Mandy as being almost like an anti-nostalgia film. I mean, like when just you pulling up Stranger Things is like a popular reference that would be widely understood across our audience. Like when we think of like what the '80s looks like in Stranger Things, like we have the fashion, the music, um, the the like standard visual aesthetics, where you need like slightly higher color contrast in the visuals, but like what I mean, Stranger Things, it doesn't end up addressing like say like all the cults that were coming out in the 80s and the drug use in the 80s. And I feel like what this is covering is kind of like, here's your 80s in Stranger Things, that's the nostalgia, and then Mandy comes along and is like, here's what the 80s was if the 80s was like the worst of the 80s. And it kind of like seems to work from there, where it's almost like screw the nostalgia, here's everything bad about the 80s in one movie, but we're gonna make it look really, really nice.
Yeah, I also kind of agree with that, and I would say, yeah, you know, obviously there are these nods to the sort of films that perhaps the director is influenced by, but I mean, I do get the sense that he's doing a lot of things in his own way still. You know, in I think it was the behind the scenes footage for Mandy on Shudder. He mentions, you know, that the role of a director is it's not about what you do, but how you do and how you do it. And I certainly get the sense that it shows these nods, but he kind of does his own thing with those various elements, and you know, makes his film stand on its own in a way that this film feels like other films I've seen, but in a way also feels like something I've never seen. And so, yeah, I think credit to his crafting there for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think and I think that idea of like anti-nostalgia is really interesting. Like, you know, if it's not anti, it definitely reveals like a darker, less warm streak of nostalgia and pulling together those influences. I'm also curious to briefly discuss before we close out the score from Johan Johansson. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Who passed away shortly after the film was released, and I know there was a brief push to try and get it nominated for an Academy Award. You know, he did the scores for Arrival and other great films that really enhance and add to the atmosphere. And I really think you can't talk about Mandy without talking about the score, because it is so vital. I mean, that opening quote, which I guess is from somebody who was on death row, is like their last words or something before being executed, with just those blaring synths, like it really does just immediately set the tone for the film and draw you in. So before we close out, I'd love to hear your impressions of the score and how that contributed to your experience of the film.
Well, yeah, for me, I totally agree. You can't talk about Mandy without talking about the score, so I'm really glad that you brought it up. Otherwise, I would have myself. You know, I think it's just, I think it's arguably his best work. I mean, I am a fan of other films that he's done as well, and of other scores he's done for those films. But I think that his sort of placement in his work's placement in this film, you know, where certain cues are cued in, and how they just really worked with the other elements of the film to provide a sense of atmosphere and tone, just I think speak to his I don't know if I want to say power or just talent as a composer, because it truly, it doesn't distract me from anything. If anything, it heightens the themes in play, whether we're in a moment of grief or love or you know, this otherworldly violence. I think it really establishes the tone in a really subtle way, and not to mention it's just a score that I'll probably play every like Halloween season from here on out. So yeah, really fabulous work.
Yeah, that was pretty much exactly what I was gonna say. Like, I mean, like, yeah, he also scored Sicario and like The Arrival, as you said, Reed. But I don't want to listen to Sicario or The Arrival. Like, the soundtracks are good, but like, I feel like this was like it's probably like a little bit of a cliche to say that like the final film composition is the greatest film composition. You know, the best work of like the creator. But I feel like that is true. Like, I think that's what contributes to me being able to say that like the film is not only just great to watch, it's like great to to just have on in the background, because like the sound is so potent, and it sounds so great, and the soundtrack is like so screeching, and then like the violent noises, and it's phenomenal. Like it changes. I feel like if they would have had like any other soundtrack, it would have just not worked. Like it just wouldn't have. Like it totally changes and adds to the tone and forms the tone of the film. And yeah, I feel like even if like you're not into the genre, if you're not into anything else, and like you're just into like music or sound design, like just to check out the film anyway, because it's like the soundtrack is so good.
Absolutely, and as a person who spent some time in undergrad working in sound, I can say I I don't know if I realized my first time over how wonderful the soundtrack is to this film, from from sound design to the score. And I want to say I think to agree with Alex, had another composer been chosen, I don't think it would have been as strong, because Johan Johansson's work is, from what I've seen at least, always not so melodic, but just more so abstract, and that just feels so appropriate for this film, because it's so different, and so I think it really just intensifies and heightens everything going on. But yeah, there's various sound moments in the film that I could bring up as examples of just wonderful sound design that's not just like authentic, but just feels like just so right for the particularly in the latter part of the film, when things start to get more psychedelic, and various cues of sound for different sort of things that feel like, oh, there's an appropriate diegetic sound that could work here, but no, we're going to do something else. And it's really wonderful if you pay attention to sound in that latter half of the film. It's really, really wonderful.
It feels like the sound design and the score pull on various influences, just like Cosmatos' script does too. So it really is a case where all these various filmmaking elements are coming together to create a really compelling, interesting genre film. And yeah, I feel like there's so much we could talk about. I mean, we haven't even talked about Nick Cage yet, but but there's so much to talk about. But there's fortunately lots of great stuff that I found while researching this. So if you want to learn more about Mandy, check out all the great interviews with Panos Cosmatos. I'm definitely excited to see what else he does next, and what Spectre Vision does next too. They've released some other great films. I know Alex is a big fan of Daniel Isn't Real, and Color Out of Space came out last year. So excited to see the work they keep helping to produce, and yeah, excited to just get more great, bold, experimental genre films. This is a great time for them, as we're seeing studios become less and less adventurous. This is the time to really get some great stuff from these more independent studios doing just wild and crazy stuff with the genre format.
Yeah, agreed. It feels kind of crazy that we haven't even talked about Nick Cage yet. I also think there's a lot to to Mandy's sort of obsession with fantasy, in everything she's reading, and how she talks about planets. We could spend a whole episode just talking about all that, but I mean, that just speaks to how much is going on in this film, and just how much I respect this film and what it's doing. So absolutely, continue some research into this and continue watching it over and over again. So with that said, that about does it for our show this week. Thank you again, Reed, for bringing this presentation on this great film for us. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation, and whether you're a returning listener or if this is your first time with us, we appreciate you tuning into our show. Please subscribe to the show on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and also spread the word. We want to reach a wider audience of film lovers, and we would love to bring in new listeners. So please follow us on Instagram at Cineposium and on Twitter at Cposium as well, to keep up with our updates and to keep in communication with us. And if you're interested in subscribing to our weekly e-newsletter, email us at cineposium.ucla@gmail.com. Thank you all again for listening. Until next week, take care, everyone.